The billionaire returned home to surprise the woman he was about to marry. But instead, he caught his fiancée in a moment that shattered everything he believed about love. Just as he was about to confront her, a poor maid suddenly grabbed his arm. Her face had gone completely pale. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely stand. Then she leaned close to his ear and whispered only two chilling words. "Don't talk." He didn't understand why, until he looked past the ballroom doors and realized that staying silent was the only reason he was about to uncover a secret worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a betrayal years in the making, and a nightmare far worse than simple cheating. But why would a frightened maid risk everything to stop a billionaire from speaking? What exactly was his fiancée hiding that required absolute silence? And when the truth finally came out, who would be begging for mercy before it was all over? 36-year-old Zephyr Calloway had built an empire that most people only dreamed about. As the founder and sole owner of Calloway Dominion Holdings, he controlled a logistics and infrastructure network worth billions of dollars, stretching across multiple states. Financial magazines regularly ranked his company among the fastest-growing private corporations in America, yet very few people could identify him in public. That anonymity wasn't an accident. It was a choice born from years of hardship and betrayal. Long before private jets, corporate boardrooms, and billion-dollar acquisitions became his reality, Zephyr had been the son of a widowed mother in the forgotten Appalachian town of Hollow Briar. His father died before he could remember his face. His mother worked herself to exhaustion in diners and laundromats until illness finally stole the little strength she had left. On the night she died, 18-year-old Zephyr left Hollow Briar carrying only a weathered backpack, a broken wristwatch that had belonged to his mother, and a promise whispered beside her hospital bed. Never let poverty decide who you become. That promise became the foundation of everything he built. For 14 relentless years, he slept in cheap motels, worked impossible hours, bought bankrupt freight companies that everyone else had abandoned, and slowly transformed failure into fortune. Every dollar he earned was reinvested. Every setback became another lesson. Every victory was earned through sacrifice. By the time he turned 36, he could purchase skyscrapers without blinking, yet he still wore the old wristwatch. It no longer kept time, but it reminded him where he had come from. Success never made him arrogant. It only made him careful. That caution explained why, 3 years earlier, he had hidden his true identity when he returned to Hollow Briar to quietly inspect land for a future distribution center. He wanted honest conversations with ordinary people, not rehearsed smiles for a billionaire. That decision changed his life. Inside the town's aging public library, he met Vespera Quill. She was beautiful without trying to be. She volunteered several afternoons each week, helping elderly residents locate books, reading stories to children, and organizing donations that barely kept the library alive. She laughed easily, spoke softly, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who seemed untouched by greed. The first conversation they shared stayed with him for years. As they stacked returned books onto a cart, she smiled and said, "I think people chase money so hard that they forget how to love." Zephyr looked at her curiously. "So you'd never marry a rich man?" She laughed. "Absolutely not. Money changes people. I'd rather spend my life with an honest man who comes home every evening than someone who measures love with bank accounts." Her answer struck him deeper than she could ever know. For the first time in years, Zephyr wondered what it would feel like to be loved for himself instead of his success. So he made a decision that would eventually become the emotional spine of his downfall. He introduced himself as nothing more than a regional business consultant who traveled frequently and earned a modest but comfortable income. He never mentioned Calloway Dominion Holdings. He never mentioned private aircraft. He never mentioned the billions. He wanted certainty before revealing the truth. Years earlier, a former business partner had attempted to manipulate him through a staged friendship after learning about his growing fortune. That painful experience taught Zephyr that wealth attracted masks as often as it attracted opportunity. His hidden identity wasn't a game or a test. It was a shield protecting the last part of his life he hoped could remain genuine. Vespera never questioned his story. Instead, she welcomed him into her world. Months passed, and their relationship deepened. They explored hiking trails around Hollow Briar, shared quiet dinners in small family-owned restaurants, and spent evenings talking beneath the stars. Zephyr believed he had finally found peace. Then came the first emergency. Vespera called him one evening, her voice trembling. "My grandmother collapsed," she cried. "The doctors say she needs surgery immediately, but we can't afford it." Without hesitation, Zephyr transferred the money. He never asked for proof, never expected repayment. He simply wanted the woman he loved to stop crying. The surgery was supposedly successful. Life returned to normal. Then several months later, another crisis arrived. Her younger brother's business had failed. Creditors were threatening lawsuits. Again, Zephyr stepped in. Again, she thanked him through tears. Again, he told her not to worry. As the years passed, one financial emergency quietly followed another. A mortgage payment, medical bills, a broken vehicle, unexpected travel expenses. Each request sounded reasonable on its own. Each one arrived wrapped in urgency and emotion. Looking back, the pattern seemed obvious. At the time, love disguised repetition as coincidence. Friends occasionally teased him. "You've become everyone's hero," one colleague joked during a phone call. Zephyr smiled. If helping the people she loves gives her peace, it's worth every penny. He believed sacrifice strengthened love. He never noticed that Vespera never insisted on sharing those burdens herself. Whenever she accepted his help, she promised, "One day I'll repay every cent." He always answered with the same gentle smile. "You already have." Those words haunted him later. 2 weeks before their wedding, Zephyr decided it was finally time to reveal everything. He purchased the most breathtaking estate overlooking Hollow Briar, a sprawling mansion surrounded by rolling hills and ancient oak trees. It wasn't meant to impress strangers. It was meant to become their home. Inside a handcrafted leather portfolio, he carefully placed the documents that represented his future with Vespera. A $30 million trust established in her name, legal papers creating a charitable foundation honoring her late parents, and a deed transferring half ownership of the estate to her immediately after their wedding. Additional financial agreements ensured both their families would never face hardship again. He rehearsed the surprise countless times during his return flight. She would see the house, then the documents. Then finally, he would tell her the truth. Not that he was wealthy, but that every promise he had ever made, to protect her, to provide for her, to build a future together, had already been fulfilled. Changing his itinerary without telling anyone, Zephyr drove toward Hollow Briar nearly a week earlier than expected. He wanted to catch her completely by surprise. As his black luxury sedan approached the mansion, a faint smile spread across his face. Then it disappeared. The front gate stood open. Several unfamiliar luxury vehicles filled the driveway. Music drifted through the warm afternoon air. Laughter echoed from somewhere deep inside the mansion. A champagne cork burst loudly enough to reach the entrance. Zephyr paused beside his car, tightening his grip on the leather portfolio. For a brief moment, he convinced himself there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps Vespera had invited friends to help with the wedding. Perhaps she had planned a celebration of her own. Completely unaware that every step he took was carrying him toward the greatest betrayal of his life, Zephyr walked through the front doors. While, somewhere inside the mansion, a frightened young maid named Sorrel caught sight of him and felt the color drain from her face. Zephyr had attended corporate negotiations, where fortunes were won or lost in a single sentence. He had stood before hostile investors, ruthless competitors, and government regulators without allowing his expression to betray a single emotion. But as he stepped into the grand foyer of the mansion, something he couldn't explain settled heavily in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. The music drifting through the house wasn't the soft instrumental playlist Vespera usually preferred. This was louder, celebratory. Glasses clinked. Laughter echoed from deeper inside the mansion. Expensive perfume lingered in the air, blending with the scent of catered food. The decorations immediately caught his attention. Fresh flowers lined the hallway. Gold ribbons wrapped around marble columns. Crystal candle holders reflected warm light across the polished floors. At first glance, it resembled an elegant pre-wedding gathering. Yet something felt off. Most of the decorations weren't the ones Vespera had chosen from the catalogs they had reviewed together months earlier. She had insisted on simple ivory roses. These were crimson. She had wanted intimate elegance. This felt extravagant, almost theatrical. Zephyr frowned. Did she change her mind? He murmured quietly to himself. He adjusted the leather portfolio beneath his arm and continued walking. The house was unusually busy. Caterers hurried through hallways carrying silver trays. Several unfamiliar guests laughed as they disappeared into another corridor. None of them greeted him. None of them even recognized him. That wasn't surprising. Almost everyone attending believed the groom was an ordinary business consultant. Only Vespera knew his face well enough to identify him instantly. Or so he believed. Before he reached the main hallway leading toward the ballroom, someone suddenly rushed around the corner. A young woman wearing a plain gray Maid's uniform froze in place. A stack of folded white linens slipped from her arms and scattered across the floor. Her eyes locked onto Zephyr. For a split second, pure terror flashed across her face. Not surprise. Not confusion. Terror. She quickly gathered the fallen linens, but her trembling hands made the task nearly impossible. Zephyr immediately bent down to help. "It's okay," he said gently. "Let me." Before he could finish the sentence, she grabbed his wrist. Her grip was astonishingly firm despite how violently she was shaking. She looked over both shoulders as though terrified someone might see them. Then she leaned closer. "So you're really here," she whispered. Zephyr blinked. "I'm sorry." Her breathing became uneven. "They said you weren't coming back until next week." Zephyr stared at her. They. Realizing what she had accidentally revealed, the young maid bit her lower lip. For several agonizing seconds, she seemed trapped between fear and conscience. Narrative memory flickered behind her frightened eyes. Only 12 days earlier, 19-year-old Sorrel had accepted this housekeeping job after her father's fatal construction accident left her responsible for supporting her younger brother. She had desperately needed steady work. The mansion's generous wages seemed like an answer to prayer. Instead, during her very first week, she had begun noticing strange conversations. Doors quickly closing whenever she approached. Guests arriving late at night. Arguments that abruptly stopped whenever staff entered the room. Then, 3 days earlier, Vespera had gathered every employee inside the service kitchen. She had held up an old photograph. The picture showed Zephyr. "If this man ever comes here unexpectedly," Vespera had ordered coldly, "call me immediately." Someone asked why. She simply smiled. Because I want to surprise him. Most employees accepted the explanation. Sorrel hadn't. There was something unnatural about the smile Vespera wore while giving those instructions. The memory tightened around Sorrel's heart. That morning, while polishing glasses outside the ballroom, she had accidentally overheard another conversation through the half-open doors. Vespera's voice. Confident. Carefree. Once tonight is over. A man laughed. He won't matter anymore. The room erupted with amusement. Sorrel never heard the rest. The head butler suddenly appeared behind her, ordering her back to work before anyone realized she had been standing there. Those words had haunted her all afternoon. Now the man from the photograph was standing directly in front of her. Completely unaware. Completely vulnerable. Her conscience refused to let her stay silent. She tightened her grip on his wrist. Listen to me very carefully. Zephyr nodded. If you trust anything today. She swallowed hard. Trust me. Her voice dropped to barely more than a breath. Don't talk. Zephyr frowned. What? Please. Her eyes glistened with tears. If they hear your voice. She looked again toward the ballroom. They'll know you're here before you see what they're doing. Every instinct Zephyr had developed during years of billion-dollar negotiations suddenly awakened. He studied her face carefully. There was no manipulation. No calculation. Only desperation. She genuinely believed she was protecting him. But why? He asked quietly. I can't explain. Who are they? She slowly shook her head. They're already inside. A long silence settled between them. For reasons Zephyr himself couldn't explain, he made a decision that would alter everything. He remained silent. Years of negotiating had taught him that people often revealed far more when they believed they were unwatched. If something truly was wrong, speaking too soon could destroy the chance to understand it. Sorrel exhaled in visible relief. This way. She motioned toward a narrow service corridor running alongside the ballroom. Unlike the main hallway, this passage had been designed for staff to move unnoticed during formal events. The corridor eventually ended beside partially open double doors, concealed behind decorative curtains. Soft light spilled through the narrow opening. Music floated into the hallway. So did laughter. Sorrel stopped walking. Her hands trembled again. I shouldn't even be doing this. You could lose your job, Zephyr said quietly. A faint, heartbreaking smile crossed her face. I know. He looked at her carefully. Then why risk it? For several seconds she couldn't answer. Finally she whispered, because someone should have told you the truth. Those words struck him with unexpected force. No employee would risk unemployment over a misunderstanding. Whatever waited beyond those doors. It was serious. Sorrel carefully moved one corner of the heavy curtain aside. Look. Zephyr stepped forward without making a sound. The ballroom came into view. Nearly 100 elegantly dressed guests filled the room. Champagne glasses sparkled beneath massive crystal chandeliers. A live string quartet played cheerful music from the far corner. Large banners decorated with gold lettering hung from the walls. At first, Zephyr smiled with relief. Perhaps he had worried for nothing. Perhaps this really was an early wedding celebration. Then he noticed the center of the room. His smile vanished. Standing beneath an enormous floral arch was Vespera. She looked breathtaking in a shimmering white evening gown that he had never seen before. She wasn't standing alone. A tall, sharply dressed man stood directly in front of her. His hand rested comfortably around her waist. The distance between them was far too intimate. Zephyr's heartbeat slowed. Every instinct inside him screamed that something was terribly wrong. Before he could process what he was seeing, the man gently lifted Vespera's chin, and she smiled at him with a warmth Zephyr had believed belonged only to himself. Time seemed to stop. Zephyr didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He simply stared through the narrow opening in the ballroom doors as the man gently cupped Vespera's face. The string quartet continued playing, filling the room with elegant music that now sounded painfully cruel. Then, Vespera closed her eyes and kissed him. It wasn't the awkward kiss of two people making a mistake. It wasn't a stolen moment born from confusion. It was slow, comfortable, passionate, the kind of kiss shared by two people who belonged together. The ballroom erupted into applause. Champagne glasses were raised into the air. Someone laughed loudly. Another guest shouted, "Finally." More laughter followed. "So we don't have to pretend anymore." Every word landed like another hammer striking Zephyr's chest. His fingers instinctively tightened around the leather portfolio until the edges dug painfully into his palm. Beside him, Sorrel lowered her head. She couldn't bear to look at his face. She had feared exactly this. At the center of the ballroom, the man wrapped one arm around Vespera's waist before accepting a champagne glass from a waiter. He raised it confidently. "One more week." The room instantly grew quieter. Everyone waited for him to continue. He smiled. "One more week." He looked affectionately at Vespera. And the idiot signs everything over. The room exploded with laughter. Several guests clapped. Someone whistled. Another called out, "To the easiest payday we've ever seen." Even the musicians struggled to hide their smiles. Zephyr's heartbeat became strangely calm. Too calm. His years in business had taught him that overwhelming pain sometimes arrived not as chaos, but as silence. He continued watching, continued listening. He needed to understand everything. The man lowered his glass. His name was Drexler Voss. Zephyr had never seen him before. Yet the ease with which Drexler stood beside Vespera spoke louder than any introduction ever could. They weren't strangers. They weren't having an affair born from impulse. This relationship had history. The evidence surrounded them. Matching glances, private jokes, comfort without hesitation. Narrative threads that had remained hidden until this moment quietly began connecting. 3 years earlier, when Zephyr first started dating Vespera, there had been mysterious weekends when she claimed she was visiting distant relatives where cell phone service barely existed. She always returned with believable stories and affectionate apologies. At the time, he admired how devoted she seemed to family. Now those unexplained disappearances took on a darker meaning. She hadn't vanished because of relatives. She had simply been spending time with another man. The foreshadowing had always been there. Love had refused to see it. One guest raised his glass toward Drexler. "I still can't believe he paid every hospital bill." Another burst into laughter. "The fake surgery almost made me feel guilty." Vespera laughed even harder. "Guilty?" She shook her head. "He practically begged me to let him help." More laughter echoed across the ballroom. Zephyr's breathing grew shallow. His mind flashed back to that frantic phone call years earlier. "Grandma needs surgery." The trembling voice. The tears. The desperate silence afterward. He remembered wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars within minutes because he couldn't bear hearing her cry. Now, Those tears replayed differently. Not grief. Performance. Another woman approached Vespera with a grin. I still have every fake medical invoice we printed. The guests laughed again. They looked real enough to fool anybody. Vespera shrugged. He never questioned anything. Someone else smirked. That's because lonely men don't investigate miracles. Drexler raised his glass again. No. They investigate numbers. He looked around proudly. So we made sure he never needed to. The room applauded. Each sentence answered another question Zephyr hadn't known he needed to ask. Every emergency. Every crisis. Every request. None had been random. Each had been carefully planned. Each had measured one thing. How much would he sacrifice before asking questions? Sorrow quietly wiped tears from her own eyes. She had suspected something terrible. She hadn't imagined something this monstrous. Then Vespera stepped onto a small decorative platform near the dance floor. She held up the engagement ring Zephyr had given her 2 years earlier. The room became silent again. She admired it beneath the chandelier. You all remember this. Several people laughed knowingly. Drexler folded his arms. I certainly do. Vespera smiled wickedly. The original diamond was beautiful. She casually removed the ring. I sold it months ago. The room burst into shocked laughter. She tossed the ring across the ballroom. Drexler caught it effortlessly. This one, he said, examining it. Cubic zirconia. More applause. One guest shook his head in disbelief. You replaced it without him noticing. Vespera rolled her eyes. He never looked closely. She leaned against Drexler. He only looked at me. The laughter became almost unbearable. Zephyr's grip on the leather portfolio tightened even further. Inside that portfolio rested documents worth more than $100 million. A $30 million trust. Half ownership of the mansion. A charitable foundation in her parents' names. A future he had spent years preparing. He had intended to hand everything to her before revealing he was actually a billionaire. Instead, he now stood listening as she celebrated deceiving him. At that very moment, if this story has you holding your breath and wondering how anyone could betray someone this completely, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss part 2, because what happens next will make this betrayal look small by comparison. And while you're here, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel before karma finally catches up with the people who deserve it. The celebration continued. One older guest laughed so hard tears formed in his eyes. I've never seen anyone milk a relationship this successfully. Another raised her glass. To Vespera, the greatest performance of the decade. The guests cheered. Vespera accepted their praise without the slightest trace of shame. Then Drexler wrapped an arm around her shoulders. My favorite part. He grinned broadly. He still thinks she's marrying him because she loves him. The ballroom erupted once more. Zephyr's expression never changed. That frightened Sorrow even more. Because devastated people usually cried. Angry people shouted. But people who became completely silent were often the most dangerous of all. Without saying a word, Zephyr slowly shifted his gaze across the room. He wasn't looking at faces anymore. He was memorizing them. Every laugh, every smile, every person applauding his humiliation, every witness, every accomplice, every name that would soon matter. The laughter refused to stop. It echoed through the ballroom like a celebration built upon the ruins of a man's heart. From behind the partially opened doors, Zephyr stood as still as stone. His breathing had slowed. His face had become unreadable. Only Sorrel noticed the tiny change in his eyes. The warmth was gone. The hopeful man who had walked into the mansion carrying dreams, wedding papers, and a future wrapped inside a handcrafted leather portfolio no longer existed. In his place stood someone terrifyingly calm. Sorrel swallowed hard. She had seen grief before. She had watched her father take his final breath after a construction crane collapsed because a contractor ignored basic safety rules. She remembered how silence had settled over the hospital room before the tears came. Since then, she had learned something about pain. The loudest heartbreak often came first, but the deepest heartbreak arrived without a sound. Zephyr wasn't making a sound. That frightened her far more than if he had screamed. Inside the ballroom, Drexler Voss raised another toast. To new beginnings. Everyone lifted their glasses. To easy money. More laughter. Vespera leaned comfortably against him, smiling as though she had already forgotten the man she was supposed to marry. Then another guest asked the question that made the room laugh even harder. So what happens after the wedding? Drexler smirked. There won't be one. Several people chuckled knowingly. He continued, we let him sign the remaining documents first. Once every asset we can reach is transferred, Vespera disappears. Someone called out, and if he comes looking? Drexler shrugged carelessly. People disappear every day. Another guest added with a grin, by the time he realizes what happened, we'll already be gone. The room applauded again. Those words answered another question Zephyr hadn't known to ask. For months, Vespera had shown an unusual interest in paperwork. She insisted on organizing every receipt, every invoice, every insurance form, and every legal document connected to the wedding. Zephyr had admired what he believed was responsibility and careful planning. Now the truth revealed itself. She hadn't been organizing a future. She had been cataloging a robbery. Every signature she encouraged. Every financial conversation she casually initiated. Every question about his savings, investments, and business travel. None of it had been innocent curiosity. It had all been reconnaissance. The realization settled into place with chilling precision, leaving no logical gaps behind. Her pattern of behavior, scattered across 3 years, now formed a complete picture. The emergencies had tested his generosity. The paperwork had mapped his finances. The wedding had been the final stage of an elaborate extraction. Zephyr slowly stepped backward from the doorway. He needed air. He needed distance. Most of all, he needed answers. Sorrel noticed him retreating and quietly followed. Neither of them spoke until they reached a quieter service hallway. I'm so sorry, she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Zephyr looked at her for the first time since witnessing the kiss. His voice remained remarkably steady. Is there anything else I need to know? Sorrel hesitated. Her conscience battled her fear once more. Then she nodded. I found something while cleaning this morning. She pointed toward a storage room at the end of the corridor. I wasn't supposed to see it. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a small brass key. The butler told me never to go inside. She placed the key in Zephyr's hand. I think it belongs to you. He studied her face. Why help me? Sorrel looked down. Because someone should have. The answer was simple. Honest. And unlike every promise Vespera had ever made, it carried no hidden agenda. Zephyr unlocked the storage room. The door creaked open. Dust floated through the dim light. At first glance, the room looked like an ordinary place for storing extra decorations and furniture. Then his eyes adjusted. Rows of neatly stacked boxes filled the shelves. Each one bore his handwriting. His pulse quickened. He opened the nearest box. Inside lay an expensive necklace he had given Vespera on their second anniversary. Still wrapped. Never worn. The next box contained designer handbags. Still inside their original packaging. The one after that held carefully folded dresses he remembered surprising her with after claiming he had found employee discounts. Every gift remained untouched. Nothing had ever been cherished. Nothing had ever been loved. He moved to another shelf. A larger container rested there beneath a layer of dust. He opened it slowly. His heart nearly stopped. Inside were dozens of handwritten letters. Every letter he had mailed during his overseas business trips. Still sealed. Unopened. He picked up the oldest one. The envelope remained exactly as he had sent it. His fingers trembled. Months of lonely nights. Words he had poured onto paper while believing the woman he loved eagerly awaited every message. She had never read a single one. His vision blurred. Not because he was crying. Because the truth hurt more than tears could express. Then he noticed another cardboard archive tucked into the corner. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Pictures from birthdays. Hiking trips. Holiday dinners. Their engagement. Frame after frame documented the happiest moments of what he thought had been their life together. But many of the photographs had been vandalized. In several, Vespera's face had been neatly cut away. In others, someone had drawn mocking comments across the borders. One image of Zephyr kneeling during the proposal had the words, "Final investment," written across the bottom in black marker. His stomach tightened. At the very back of the shelf rested a black leather notebook. Unlike everything else, it showed signs of frequent use. Zephyr opened it. Each page contained dates, dollar amounts, descriptions, hospital bill, mortgage payment, business bailout, vacation, jewelry. Every expense he had ever covered was listed with frightening accuracy. Beside many entries appeared handwritten comments. Success. Believe the story immediately. Increase emotional attachment. Next request scheduled in 6 weeks. His breathing became heavier. He turned another page. Near the end of the notebook, he found his own name written in bold ink. Beneath it appeared one final sentence. Final extraction after wedding. Nothing else. No memories. No affection. No dreams. Just an accounting record. A 3-year relationship reduced to a financial ledger. The emotional foundation of the entire deception became horrifyingly clear. Years earlier, Drexler Voss had buried himself beneath enormous gambling debts owed to violent lenders. Rather than face ruin, he and Vespera created a calculated scheme. Find a compassionate outsider, build complete emotional trust, drain him through carefully staged crises, marry him if necessary, then seize whatever remained before disappearing. Zephyr had not been their first victim. Smaller targets had funded their lifestyle before him. What they never anticipated was that the quiet man they mocked as an ordinary consultant was secretly one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. The notebook slipped closed. Silence filled the room. Sorrow watched from the doorway. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. Zephyr looked down at the leather portfolio, still tucked beneath his arm. Inside were documents that could have changed Vespera's life forever. A $30 million trust. Half ownership of the estate. A charitable foundation honoring the parents she claimed to miss every day. A future built entirely from love. Slowly, very slowly, He placed the portfolio on a nearby table. His expression revealed nothing. Not grief. Not rage. Not despair. Only decision. Far away, the ballroom doors swung open. Footsteps echoed into the hallway. Someone had finally realized the groom had arrived. Voices drifted closer. Did anyone see him? Another voice answered, check the entrance. Sorrel instinctively stepped backward. Her heart pounded. Vespera's laughter suddenly stopped. The silence inside the ballroom spread like wildfire. One by one, conversations died. Then came the sound of high heels approaching the corridor. Zephyr lifted his eyes. The broken young man who had entered the mansion carrying hope was gone forever. What remained was a billionaire who now possessed something far more dangerous than wealth. He possessed the truth. And while everyone inside that ballroom still believed, they were hunting a heartbroken fool. They had no idea they had just declared war on the most powerful man any of them had ever met. End of part 1.